The valley floor was a graveyard of dry leaves and snapped twigs. Every gust of wind sent the debris skittering across the hard-packed earth, a dry, scratching sound that echoed against the canyon walls. It started as a low whistle through the gaps in the rock, but within seconds, the pitch climbed. The air grew heavy, pressing down with a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. The forest floor shifted. Dead branches rolled across the soil, colliding with the roots of the trees. A fine grit rose into the air, stinging the bark of the standing timber. The wind was no longer just moving, it was hunting. It tore through the clearing, catching the loose debris and spinning it into miniature, chaotic cyclones that danced between the trunks. The sound became a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated through the ground. Leaves that had clung to the branches all summer were stripped away in a single, violent motion, swirling into the darkness of the valley. The sky turned a bruised, deep purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The forest held its breath. The wind hit the valley with the force of a physical blow, turning the clearing into a gauntlet of flying wood and dust. At the edge of the clearing, the ancient oak stood as a monument to permanence. While the surrounding air turned into a chaotic blur of debris, the tree remained locked in place. Its thick, gnarled trunk absorbed the initial assault of the gale without a tremor. The wind slammed into the bark, searching for a weakness, but the oak refused to give an inch. Every fiber of its massive frame was braced against the pressure. It did not sway. It did not lean. The tree held its ground with a stubborn, heavy power that seemed to challenge the storm itself. The wind whistled through the gaps in its branches, a high-pitched scream that signaled the intensity of the pressure. Yet the trunk stayed rigid. It was a pillar of wood and sap, anchored deep into the bedrock of the valley. The bark groaned under the sheer force of the gusts, a deep, resonant sound. But the tree did not yield. It stood defiant, a singular point of resistance, in a forest that was otherwise beginning to lose its composure. The storm pushed harder, trying to force the oak to bend, but the tree remained fixed, its structure holding firm against the relentless, invisible weight of the gale. Just feet away from the unyielding oak, the landscape told a different story. A dense cluster of bamboo stalks stood exposed to the same relentless gale. Unlike the heavy timber, these slender forms began to react the moment the wind surged. They did not fight the pressure. Instead, they swayed in a frantic, rhythmic dance, their long segments bowing under the strain. With every fresh gust, the stalks arched further toward the mud, their tips nearly touching the earth. The contrast was stark. While the oak remained a static, immovable object, the bamboo became a blur of motion, constantly repositioning itself to survive the onslaught. The wind whipped through the hollow stalks, creating a low, whistling hum that underscored the danger of the storm. Each stalk acted as a spring, storing the kinetic energy of the gale and releasing it in sharp, snapping movements. They were being pushed to their absolute limits, bending until they were almost horizontal, yet they refused to snap. The leaves lashed against the soil, frantic and blurred, as the stalks fought for balance in the chaos. The storm intensified, and the bamboo continued to dive and recover, a fragile, green counterpoint to the massive, silent defiance of the tree standing beside them. The atmosphere in the valley curdled. The wind, previously a steady roar, escalated into a series of violent, irregular pulses that hammered the clearing. Above, the clouds thickened and bled into a deep, bruised purple, casting a sickly light over the forest floor. The air pressure dropped sharply, making the very ground feel unstable. The oak tree, which had stood as a pillar of defiance, finally began to show the cost of its rigidity. The wind caught the upper canopy, twisting the massive crown with a force that defied the strength of wood. High above the ground, a primary branch began to groan. It was a low, grinding sound of fiber, tearing against fiber, audible even over the screaming gale. The branch shuddered, its connection to the trunk straining under the relentless, invisible weight. Every gust forced the limb further, pushing it past the limit of its structural integrity. The tree remained locked in its position, refusing to sway, forcing the branch to absorb the entirety of the kinetic energy. The groan deepened into a rhythmic, metallic screech. The branch hung at an unnatural angle, vibrating with the strain, while the trunk stood motionless, trapped in its own refusal to yield to the fury of the gale. The groan of the branch reached a pitch that silenced the wind. It was no longer a sound of resistance, but of surrender. The fibers at the junction point frayed, white splinters erupting from the bark as the wood reached its absolute limit. Then, the tension snapped. A sound like a cannon blast tore through the valley, sharp and sudden, cutting through the roar of the gale. The massive branch gave way instantly, losing its hold on the trunk. It plummeted, a heavy, jagged weight of timber slicing through the air. The impact was violent. It struck the saturated earth with a force that sent a spray of mud and debris flying into the surrounding brush. The branch landed deep, embedding itself into the sodden ground, its weight shifting the very soil beneath it. The clearing shuddered. Where the limb had once been, a raw, jagged wound remained on the trunk, leaking sap into the rain. The oak stood for a heartbeat, unbalanced and shuddering, as the weight of the missing limb left it exposed to the full, unchecked force of the storm. The failure had begun, and the structure was no longer capable. The instability was terminal. Without the weight of the branch to balance its center of gravity, the oak began to twist. The wind caught the remaining canopy, acting like a sail on a broken mast, exerting a torque that the trunk was never designed to withstand. A long vertical fissure appeared near the base, a hairline fracture that widened with every passing second. The sound was not a snap, but a deep, rhythmic grinding of wood fibers being torn apart from the inside out. The heartwood began to bulge, with a final, agonizing groan that vibrated through the very ground. The oak split. It did not topple. It cleaved. The trunk tore down the center, a clean, jagged line that raced from the base to the crown. The inner core, pale and raw, was instantly exposed. Water poured into the newly opened cavity, washing away the sap. The two halves of the giant stood for a moment, separated by the void. The storm roared through the gap as the once mighty structure surrendered. The giant was a broken monument to its own inability to yield. Beside the wreckage of the fallen giant, the bamboo stalks faced the same relentless gale. They were thin, light, and seemingly fragile against the sheer force of the storm. As the wind surged, the stalks whipped violently, their slender forms arching toward the ground. They did not fight the pressure. They did not attempt to hold their position against the invisible weight of the air. Instead, they leaned further, pushing their limits until the arc became a bow. The wind howled, seeking to snap them, to find the breaking point that had claimed the oak. But the bamboo had no rigid core to shatter. They continued to descend, their leaves brushing the mud, their stems bending until they were nearly horizontal. The stalks flattened completely against the saturated soil, pressing themselves into the earth as if trying to become part of the ground itself. By surrendering their height, they removed the leverage the wind needed to destroy them. The gale passed over their flattened forms, rushing through the clearing without resistance. They were no longer targets for the storm. They were part of the landscape. They had traded their stature for their lives, letting the storm exhaust its fury. The howling gale lost its teeth. The pressure in the air dropped, and the violent thrashing of the trees slowed to a rhythmic sway. The eye of the storm had arrived, bringing a sudden, heavy stillness to the clearing. In the mud, the bamboo began to move. It was a slow, deliberate ascent. The stalks, which had been pinned against the soil, started to lift their tips, shaking off the weight of the trapped rainwater. Droplets flew from the leaves, scattering into the air as the stalks regained their vertical posture. One by one, they straightened, their fibers flexing back into place, showing no signs of the ordeal they had endured. They stood tall again, swaying slightly in the fading breeze, fully intact. A few feet away, the reality of the storm remained fixed in the earth. The oak did not rise. It could not. Its split trunk was a jagged, immobile monument to the gale. The two halves sat heavy in the mud, the raw, pale interior of the wood darkening as it soaked up the rain. The tree was a broken stump, its canopy lost, its structure permanently compromised. The contrast was absolute. The bamboo moved with the wind and returned to its former height, while the oak now occupied the ground as a permanent casualty of the storm. The forest fell completely silent. The wind had vanished, leaving only the rhythmic, steady drip of water falling from the leaves onto the mud. The clearing held the evidence of two different paths. One had chosen the path of absolute resistance, standing firm until the internal pressure shattered its core. The other had chosen the path of movement, yielding to the force until the danger passed. The broken stump of the oak remained, a static reminder that rigidity is often the precursor to destruction. Beside it, the bamboo stood tall, having traded the pride of standing firm for the wisdom of bending. This was the lesson written in the soil and the shattered wood. True strength is not found in the refusal to change, or the stubborn insistence on holding one's ground. True strength is the capacity to adapt. It is the ability to recognize when the world pushes against you with more force than you can withstand. It is the intelligence to bend, to lower your profile, and to let the pressure pass over you rather than through you. When the storms of life arrive, the rigid will eventually snap under the weight of their own convictions. But those who possess the flexibility to yield, to adjust, and to move with the current will remain standing long after the gale has faded. To survive is to be fluid. To endure is to bend, not break.